women, communities, families, survivors, experts, and allies who've literally worked for decades to shine a light on the crisis that is this murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls, and to demand accountability for these murders and disappearances by governments and institutions. We wouldn't even have had a national inquiry but for their continued and ongoing advocacy. And Canada's failure to provide a proper plan, which we will talk about today, lies at the responsibility of federal and provincial governments. It is not the responsibility of the groups who have provided input into the current plan or those who have been advocating for all of these years. We also want to note before we start that this comes at a particularly difficult time for Indigenous women and families who are also residential school survivors. The discovery of the mass grave of 215 children represents an incomprehensible trauma to the Secwepemc peoples, survivors, and communities all across the country who have long known about the unmarked and mass graves in this country. And this is yet another reason why Canada has to take concrete steps to end the genocide and all forms of harms to our people. So we have a specific order today. Each person, like I said, will speak for 3 minutes and then we'll get to questions. And the first person speaking today is Cookbee Chief Judy Wilson. She's the Secretary Treasurer of the Union of BC Indian Chiefs. Chief Judy.
Thank you for the opening. And I'm calling in from unceded Secwepemc territory in this near, where the residential school is. So my heart is heavy still for the 215 children in unmarked burial site there, the residential school. And my father's a residential school survivor as well. So we're one thing I was noticing in the plan is overall that, justice delayed is still justice denied. And that, we can't wait 3 years for, some of these priorities to be handed down. Since the national inquiry, hundreds of women have gone missing and murdered, many in our valleys and in our area. They go to court and they look for justice and they're not finding it. And also, the lack of prevention, we still, many of the priority actions are more reactive, and, we need to get, the prevention piece is so important, because a lot of the women in those, and two-spirited in those difficult situations need that assistance now, not 3 years later, and not in a reactionary basis. We need to be more proactive, and this plan doesn't call for that. The other part is, we look at the critical infrastructure, the critical housing, the critical physical things that our women and two-spirited need. And, there needs to be more of a commitment. We don't know how the added monies are going to be dispersed. Is that going to just organizations, or is that going to the critical needs of the women? But the one biggest point I know in the coalition group we're part of in the Vancouver area with 30 organizations and survivors and, all of the loved ones, we weren't a part of this at all. We had called on to ADM Gina Wilson to make a correction. We wrote letters. We talked to Minister Bennett. Regional Chief TG called for both the Trail of Tears and the Vancouver Coalition Group to be included, and we were not. So I don't know how this can be called an inclusive process. It was very structured and very bureaucratic, even though I know there were some other organizations that participated, but it was selective of government. It was the typical divide and conquer. And I don't like to see that, because I did call in the very onset for this to be Indigenous women led and this to be inclusive process, not organization led. And I'm very disappointed in how the federal government has conducted this. It should have been more open, more transparent, more easy for groups to be part of this. But again, we're looking from the outside in and hoping that a plan is going to be meaningful and substantive. And I hate to go to a lot of the women in our groups and on front lines and those in court and those that are just recently lost loved ones, or those that are still searching for their loved ones, whether it's 2 years, 5 years, or 30 years. and tell them we still have a long way to go with this federal plan, and it's in two parts, so it's kind of confusing to understand. And we're hoping to get better clarity on it, but to explain it to a lot of the women that are suffering and their loved ones is going to be very difficult. Thank you.
Thank you, Chief Judy. And we'll go next to Madame Vivienne Michel, Madame la Présidente des Femmes Autochtones du Québec.
Oui. Oui, je suis là. Je vais me servir de ma traductrice qui est au téléphone qui va traduire.
My translator who's with me with a cell phone, so she'll be translating me.
D'accord.
Can we hear me properly? Yes? Okay, fine. Thank you. So the National Action Plan that has been presented this morning, titled Plan d'Action National Action Plan 2020, in order to end the violence to the women. It's a really controversial issue. Native women of Quebec is realizing that the action plan explicitly mentioned violence in all ways, in all forms, that the women and the girls are going through. Native women of Quebec is really happy that it's presented itself as a national plan recognizing of the violence. Viviane, si tu coupais, toi, tu devrais pas m'entendre, moi. Okay, whatever. Let's continue this one, okay? Because she's hearing me at the same time, so it's confusing. It's okay. Let's go. Yeah, okay, right. Let's go. She said she'll going a little bit farther down the line because since I'm doing consecutively, she's wasting her time. So National Action Plan pretend to respond to the need of the women and the LGBTQQIA. None of the concrete actions, neither, and none of those things are figuring and being part of their plan. The identified action and the means in order to obtain the results in short and long terms are really not corresponding to the women we represent. The Native Women of Quebec is questioning the plan. We'd like it to be really representative and forward the women's needs and objectives. And including those people to SLGBTQQIA. We don't believe that there's a real will of understanding and responding. The lack of concrete action within the plan is really raising great frustration. To Native Women of Quebec, formally request major modification. So this action plan would merit its name. Our organization are really working right now to put in a plan that is really respectful of missing and murdered women. Contrary to the national plan that has been presented to us, we're consulting right now. And trying to work together with our members, our Native representative, and the Quebec family. considering that there's no collaboration in between the different levels of government. Then what would be the purpose of the work that we have already started? Thank you very much. I'm sorry for the consecutive. We'll have to settle this situation better next time. Merci.
Merci beaucoup, Vivienne.
Merci,
Dr. Dawn Harvard Laval of Ontario Native Women's Association is next.
Miigwech, Pam. Wanted to start by acknowledging the hard work we did in the development of this national action plan. Can everybody hear me okay? But we also at the same time need to acknowledge those families, the survivors, and those organizations who were not chosen. And their voices deserve to be heard. They have a wealth of knowledge, those grassroots women's organizations that have been doing this, who have been having these conversations for decades now, were left out of this process. And we want to acknowledge the importance of their knowledge and their value. Because unfortunately, the nation-to-nation approach, while it was an important change in the way this government deals with Indigenous peoples, what people don't recognize is that this excludes many Indigenous women who are not connected to a First Nation, a Métis organization, or an Inuit land claim organization. We know that over 80% of Indigenous people across this country are not specifically living on a First Nation territory. We have seen with the recent COVID dollars how many women and children slip through the cracks because of a nation-to-nation approach, because this doesn't necessarily address the way that our women and children need to access services and supports the way they live their lives, where they are in the community, because our communities are very diverse. And this is something that was forgotten and still needs to be addressed. And we're optimistic and hopeful that if we address this at this point, this can be a significant change in terms of how this action plan is implemented in order to make the difference at the community level. So because that means, that's the largest population of Indigenous women across Canada, we did our own work. We engaged with over 5,000 Indigenous women, and we found two themes emerged. And one is about ensuring Indigenous women's safety. And two, it was about addressing the needs of the families and the survivors, because systemic change at all levels is necessary. And the real concern, when we talk about a national action plan that does not have a primary focus on prevention, we are never going to break the cycle. It's absolutely critical that we have processes, that we have conversations, that we're deeply concerned, that we need to prioritize prevention. When the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, when the United Nations came out and said that Canada had committed grave human rights violations in their failure to prevent the violence, in their failure to protect Indigenous women, that's what needs to be our primary focus moving forward out of this action plan, is focusing on that prevention. And that's something that for this action plan to be effective, we need to see that the Indigenous and how this is going to be actioned. And that way, recognizing and honoring the role of our Indigenous women as leaders in our communities, that has been there since time immemorial, and that was broken by colonization. But our women are reclaiming their place, and it's time for the government to recognize that we have a shared leadership role. And if we want to restore balance for our families and safety for our communities, we need to recognize that women's leadership. And we also need to recognize, and right now, as we've honored those precious lives of those 215 children, of the need for healing in our communities. Never has it been more important that we talk about reinstating the Aboriginal Healing Foundation and healing for our Indigenous community members, because it's not something that happens within a few years in a short-term program. It's something that's going to take time, and we need to recommit right now more than ever as we're going to go through that process, because we need the restoration of our identities, our culture, our worldviews, to restore our balance and learn how to take care of our families and our communities and be able to stand up for ourselves again, and recognizing and investing in restoring our Indigenous communities. But when we talk about communities, opening our eyes to the fact that that means First Nations, that does mean the North, but that also means urban communities, rural communities, and oftentimes even in mixed communities living with side by side with non-Indigenous people, they still need that support, and we still need to recognize that that's where our women are, and that's where we need to look, and that's where we need to do the work.
Thank you, Dawn. Our next speaker is Sharon McIver, Feminist Alliance for International Action. You're on mute, Sharon.
Thank you, Pam. The ongoing discrimination in the Indian Act has been one of Canada's most effective tools of assimilation. And the United Nations and Inter-American Commission on Human Rights and the Commission on the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls has found it to be the key reason that the Indigenous women and girls are in the position they are today. While Canada has worked and has improved the discrimination in the Indian Act, it is not effective because Canada has failed to let the people know, the women know, that they are actually eligible for registration. They have not done any kind of outreach, and their process of registration takes years for people to be able to be effectively registered. What we've asked the government for over the last few years is an expedited process. Many of the women who are eligible and should have been registered are now, they're still not registered, and they could not access any services that they're entitled to during this past COVID situation that we've been engaged in. So what we were looking for is for the government to use an expedited process. I can get my passport in a week, but I can't get my status card for sometimes 3 or 4 years. And that's because that's if I'm already registered. If I get registered and then have to do it, it's 5, 6, 8 years sometimes. And some have done the calculation and say, in order to get the tens of thousands of women who are now newly eligible to be able to start to belong to their communities again, for some of them, it might take up to 80 years. So it's totally unacceptable. The government has put into place a process where they took the women out of the community for assimilation processes. They're doing nation to nation discussions with bands that haven't had their women back, and they cannot participate. And they deserve the right to be recognized and be able to rejoin their community. Thank you.
Thank you, Sharon. Next is Dr. Lingale.
Action plan, and that it recognizes the higher rate of victimization for women, Indigenous women and girls who have disabilities. I don't see a plan addressing their lived reality. The reason for this, I suggest, is because disability is not recognized as a significant pillar of a person's identity, where thus the barriers they face were not folded into the process and outcome. In this way, the intersectional lens failed. The plan fails to mention and concretely address that relative to the larger Canadian population, Indigenous women are 1.5 times more likely than non-Indigenous women to report having a disability. This higher rate of disability should not be interpreted as the Indigenous body being inferior. Rather, this has to do with the result of Canada's ongoing genocide, resulting in poor air and water quality, poverty and a lack of nutritious food, and poor housing. This is due to the loss of land, the corporate resource extraction industry, issues of environmental racism, the residential school system, and the ongoing and never-ending sex discrimination in the Indian Act. The issue of unknown and unstated paternity continues to exist. In offering more data, in 2018, Statistics Canada offered 2 crucial data findings. First, Indigenous women with a disability are 2 times more likely than Indigenous women who do not have a disability to report a sexual assault. And second, Indigenous women living with a disability are 1.5 times more likely than non-Indigenous women with a disability to report sexual assault. These higher rates of disabilities and victimization can be acted upon right away. There is no need for more statistical data. This is an emergency situation. Since the 1981 Obstacles Report and the 1996 Royal Commission on Aboriginal People, many recommendations have been made, such as the call for accessible housing, funding for caregivers, screening of service providers, accessible transportation, the elimination of jurisdictional barriers, the elimination of language barriers in the province of Quebec. Indigenous women and girls are bigger targets of sexual violence because some cannot see or hear perpetrators approach. Others are unable to escape perpetrators because they're dependent on wheelchairs as their mode of transportation, where others cannot escape perpetrators because they are paralyzed and confined to their beds, unable to move and defend themselves. This requires emergency action now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lynn. Our next speaker is Sheila Day from the Feminist Alliance for International Action. Unmute, Sheila.
I just did. Thank you, Pam. Let's be clear. What was issued this morning is not a national action plan. A national action plan asks and answers the questions: what, how, who, and when. We were looking for and expecting concrete actions with responsibilities assigned, timelines, and resource allocations. That is not what we see here. What we have is some restatements of some of the calls for justice, but not a lot more. Secondly, the other thing that we were expecting was some real intergovernmental connection. There are overlapping and shared jurisdictions for many of the central issues here: social welfare, housing, child welfare, justice, policing. There are overlapping and, as they say, shared jurisdictions. Governments have to work together in order to have an effective national action plan to address this crisis of murders and disappearances. Instead, what we have is a collection of federal, provincial, territorial statements that were issued to us this morning. There is so much that needs to be done here. I was pleased to hear the Prime Minister say again this morning, this is a genocide. He recognizes it. We need a very urgent, immediate, concrete action plan. That is not what we got this morning. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sheila. And I'll just say for my part that, Canada is a state perpetrator of historic and ongoing genocide that specifically targets Indigenous women and girls in very unique ways for violence, exploitation, dispossession, and oppression. And I don't see anything in the federal pathway specifically or in the National Action Plan where Canada has stepped forward in a very concrete way to say this. What is the this? And that this is genocide. Here are all the ways in which we are responsible for that genocide. Here are the concrete actions that we are going to take collectively with federal and provincial territorial governments to end the genocide on an urgent basis. We didn't see that. What we saw was the federal government trying to, what appeared to hide behind the important work of the families and the advocates who have been trying for decades to push the government forward into a real path. What we have here is not an action plan, but we have a delay for the future. So there's going to be This was essentially a statement that in the future, we're going to have an implementation, which is going to, in the future, have some other plans and some other target dates. And Indigenous women and girls deserve a lot better than that. This plan says it's the first step. Can you imagine 2 years after the national inquiry that this is a first step, a plan that isn't a plan? And most shockingly, to call it evergreen. The last thing I want to hear in this country is that we have evergreen genocide, because that means there is no target end date, no measuring. I want the genocide to end now. And there are many, many concrete actions that they could take within the next 2 weeks to end genocide. They could stop fighting residential school survivors in court. They could stop fighting First Nations children in foster care in court. They could immediately register all of the First Nations women and children and grandchildren who have been excluded and make reparations. They could immediately have transitional housing for women, emergency supports around families. These are all things that can be done as a matter of policy and don't require changes to the law or 5 years worth of engagements. The fact that they haven't done these bare minimum things causes me significant alarm, primarily for the right now health, safety, and well-being of Indigenous women and children. That we haven't treated this like the pandemic, like the national crisis it is on a federal or provincial level. And I think that Canada needs to do better. And so what we will do is go to questions from the accredited media here. Please just send me your name and affiliation in the chat, and I will get to people as they appear in the chat. Hopefully the chat function has been enabled for all of the accredited media and attendees that are here. I'm assuming that's the case. It looks like it is. And one question, please direct it to the specific person that you want to answer it. So we will open it up now to questions. And hopefully, I don't see the chat. So, oh, we do. Okay. We have CBC Indigenous, Kanahesio Deer. Please go ahead.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for taking questions. So I don't have a question for anyone specific, but were all of you and the organizations you represent excluded from the National Action Plan process?
I can confirm I was.
And this Chief Wilson, we can confirm the coalition, and there was a group of Trail of Tears that were excluded as well. We wrote letters to ADM Gina Wilson, and we have it on record. And that was, we actually called for regional chief to intervene, and all of that fell on deaf ears.
This is Dawn Harvard, and I want to confirm that we actually fought very hard to try to be included, because when we left the Native Women's Association of Canada a number of years ago, it left a gap. So to suggest that the Native Women's Association of Canada is representing all Indigenous women across Canada is a clear falsehood if the largest population of Indigenous women, which is here in Ontario, are not represented by that organization, and therefore were not represented at that table. We understand the importance of recognizing nation to nation, but that can't be the only thing. We have to make sure that those who are not part of that table still have the opportunity to have a voice, and that wasn't acknowledged or recognized.
Et Vivienne, des Femmes Autochtones du Québec.
Yes, Viviane would like to say something. As far as we're concerned, we were not included for those consultations for this national plan. And us at Native Women of Quebec, we have the same title as Native Women of Canada, as well as the FNQL, FN. We're our native organization recognized by the federal. And we have not been consulted, of course. and at the same time, we are no longer belonging to the Native Women of Canada. So this organization, NWAC, is not representing Quebec. So therefore, there were no real collaboration work with organization within the provinces. Because organizations that do field work, therefore we understand and know the real needs of our women and girls. Thank you very much.
Merci, Vivienne. I
Merci,
have
Vivienne.
Jenny from Sudbury.com.
Alors, Jenny.
Hello, can you hear me?
Oui,
Yeah.
Jenny.
Perfect. What I'm looking for is some
Moi, ce que je
information
cherche,
on the groups that were included.
c'est de voir celles qui sont
Yeah,
incluses.
hour and a half presentation, and there were several people that spoke
Il y
about
a
their
eu
involvement
plusieurs
with the
personnes qui
National
ont
Action
parlé.
Plan.
Excuse me just for a minute. Mireille, can you mute your microphone?
Yeah, it is.
There we go. Okay, sorry, Jenny, can you start over?
No, but not a problem at all. There were several groups included in the hour and a half long briefing session from the Prime Minister and Carolyn Bennett. I'm wondering about those groups and if anyone has a comment on why specifically they were included.
This is Chief Wilson. Just right off the bat, it was a selective process. So it wasn't an open and transparent process. There was a selection going on. We don't know exactly how these groups all got selected or how they represent or accountability to other groups, as you heard just from the Quebec women and also the from Dawn Harvard. It's very clear it was a selective process, which left many of the voices out, which is very clear in what we're saying here at the press conference. And also what's ludicrous is that now we see a number of action plans being developed. The National Women's Action Committee or Aboriginal Committee are doing their own action plan. And we also understand some of the regions are doing their own action plans. Who is going to be responsible for the implementation of that? Who is going to fund that? It's all fragmented. We need structural changes to policy, legislation, and practice. How is this going to happen now with a fragmented approach now? And we're all expected to put in our action plans. And that's really a ludicrous process, what we're looking at now.
Okay, so if there's no other comments, I'll go to Teresa from the Canadian Press.
Thank you very much.
Hi, thank you very much for taking our questions. I wanted to just pick up on something that Chief Wilson was mentioning about the fragmented approach and just the fact a number of you mentioned that there were more than that the different provinces, territories, federal government all kind of have their own sort of, you characterize them as statements. Wondering how you think that will impact how this moves forward in terms of if all these different provinces have different plans and they're not interconnected, what will that mean for women and survivors on the ground?
Was that directed at someone in particular or just anyone in the group?
Anyone who wants to jump in.
Vivienne, des Femmes Autochtones du Québec.
Yeah, Vivienne would like to answer. When FADA inquiries have ended their work and they tabled their report on the 3rd of June 2019, many women organizations across the Quebec and across Canada has been called upon by Bennett on the 13th of June precisely. Native Women of Quebec has tabled their recommendation at that meeting. That each province should work on a national plan. And then get a national meeting to bring all together these plans and try to get a coordination. which would have definitely reflect the reality of each province. Which was not their case. And then 1 year later, nothing still had been tabled in 2020. Now we're facing an action plan, national action plan with a lot of lacks and gaps. Just to say that now the government is tabling a national plan, but it's really absolutely incomplete. And all the work that has been presented in his working table had never been presented and listened to or taken into consideration. Thank you.
Sheila?
Yeah. I just want to say, I think provinces and territories, as Viviane has said, will have different strategies and actions they want to take. But there are some core actions that must be coordinated between all levels of government. And they have to do with some, central issues here. Actually, in the National Action Plan this morning, they make a gesture towards basic income and housing, for example. Those things have to be talked about at intergovernmental tables. All levels of government are involved. The same thing I would say with policing. We can't have, just jurisdictional differences about how policing is done in this country for Indigenous women and communities. So there's just a huge need for coordination across the provinces and territories, even if they have then separate plans as well.
Thank you, Sheila. We have Kathleen Martins from APTN News with a question. Go ahead, Kathleen.
Hi, everyone. I'm wondering, this is in response to what Chief Judy mentioned, and then it's open to anyone else who would like to respond. A lot of people will hear about the plan from you, your leader, you as leaders. What will you tell them? How are you going to describe what was delivered today?
It's still continued denied justice. It's delayed justice and denied justice. And also that there's still no accountability of government. So with this fragmented approach, now, if all these different organizations are doing their own action plans and they're trying to get funded for it, where does that leave the accountability at the end of the day to the government? At the end of the day, it's going to fall back to us, which clearly the genocide that Canada enacted on our women, girls, and Two-Spirited, and our people, including our children that were found at the Kamloops residential school, are clearly going to be no other path again for that true justice we need. And I think it's important that, I think Canada strategically laid that plan out to have no accountability. That's what I'm saying.
Okay, thank you, Chief Judy. Would anyone else like to answer that?
Go ahead, Dawn.
I think when we're talking to the families and the survivors, and here in Ontario, one of the most important things that we're saying is that the work is just barely beginning here. As everybody has mentioned, that this is called a national action plan. This aspires to be a national action plan, but if we were ready to roll up our sleeves, include those women's organizations that are doing the work at the grassroots level, have their voices, we can take this as a beginning start point and work at the community level and actually start to make the changes that we need in terms of addressing child welfare concerns, addressing, as Pam said, stop wasting money fighting compensation for residential school survivors, fighting in the courts. Take that focus, use that at the grassroots level. So I think, this may not have achieved the level we wanted, but it's something, and we need to take that and run with it. But I think they can also see it with this level of fragmentation. that the time has come to include those voices, because we can come up with something really strong if we include those voices.
Go ahead, Sharon.
I just wanted to add that what's really been missing from the conversation is the violation of the rights of the women. We're talking about programs. We're talking about somebody deciding to do something. And from the work that I've done over many years, it's about the rights. They have the right to belong to the community. They have the right to be safe. They have the right not to be trafficked. And we don't even talk about that. We're talking about abstract ideas. But you have to understand that the women, the multi-generational women that have been violated, they have their human rights violated, and nobody's talking about that. We're talking about who's going to get money. I have done a lot of litigation against Canada, is probably why they're not including me in anything. And I think Lynn is in the same situation. And my organization, FAFIA, Sheila and I actually have done the bulk of the international work with the United Nations and the Inter-America Commission on Human Rights, along with Pam and Dawn and Vivian, because we as a group have appeared in these various venues. So, we can talk about little things, but the core is these women have rights, and those rights are not being recognized or respected. And today, what we saw with their action plan and their pathways, it doesn't address any of that. They don't even recognize, they may say genocide, but they haven't recognized the deaths and all of the violations that no matter how much you do, that none of that can be undone, but it should be recognized. And who was the perpetrator of that? And are those perpetrators going to step up and say, yes, I'm a perpetrator and I'm going to help try to fix this?
Thank you, Sharon. Lynn?
So I would say that the most oppressed Indigenous women and girls with disabilities, their issues are not being addressed. And again, a big part of that is because disability is not seen as part of a person's identity. And so then that's not been folded into the process. But what I also want to say is that Indigenous women and girls with disabilities, they need their eye care, their medical care, and their dental care. And so I have to go back to what Sharon says, that we really need to have Canada expedite these application processes, because these Indigenous women and girls with disabilities need the medications immediately. It's an emergency. Thank you.
Thank you, Lynn. Chief Judy?
I just wanted to add, I don't know what Canada is afraid of. What are they scared of? Why not work with on the ground experts and be inclusive in preparing that national action plan? At the end of the day, maybe Canada is worried about how much it would cost, and actually make structural changes that are going to make the difference to all of our women and children and Two-Spirit and our people. So that I just wanted to add that.
Thank you so much, Chief Judy. I would just add quickly before we go on to the next question that this is being treated more like a process for programs and services and applications for funding, as opposed to Canada and the provinces stepping up and taking responsibility for genocide, the state-sanctioned, state-perpetuated, and state-involved kinds of violence against our communities, and the ongoing grave human rights violations that the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights and all of the United Nations human rights treaty bodies have called on Canada to end. And that's what's most discouraging here, that this is going to be treated like a program as opposed to an actual national action plan to end genocide. So the next question comes from Sherry from Windspeaker. Go ahead, Sherry.
Hi, this question is open to anybody who wants to answer. I'm wondering if you see anything good at all in the National Action Plan. It can't,
this is Chief Wilson, it can't be a full action plan when it didn't include the people on the ground and the people that have been working on this, we've been marginalized and excluded from it, even though when we asked in letters and were really patient in dialoguing with Minister Bennett and other ministers on this to ask for that space. So I can't fully call it a full action plan. I know there was people that worked on it and they were included in the process, but we can't have addressing genocide in a marginalized process that Pam just described. So in all, again, now it's fragmented action plans from different organizations across Canada. I don't know who's going to do ours in BC, but they haven't talked to us either. We haven't had any dialogue from any of those tables. So that's very problematic. And, there was a lot of our groups that have worked many years, decades and decades on this. And so I can't say how fully Canada can say that they're addressing it through this process when they selectively appointed people. And, maybe some of the issues are identified, but it can't be approached in a good way because of the fragmentation now that they put on us. We didn't ask for a fragmented approach to a national action plan, but that's what they've done to us now. Now we're forced as different organizations to look at what our action plans are and submit them. And we're 2 years out, and women and girls and Two-Spirited continue to go missing, murdered, and succumb to violent daily occurrences that are happening.
Judy, Lynn?
So is that okay if I speak now?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay, so I could see a millimeter or maybe a fraction of a millimeter of good things happening in this document. So for example, they're using the word intersectional, they're using the word ableism, but Indigenous people have been asking for, they've been putting forward their recommendations since the 1980s, and so we are entitled to more than a millimeter of good.
Thank you, Lynn. Go ahead, Dawn.
I think everybody's pointed out, that it's a start. It's a start. And there was a lot of good people with good hearts come out, family, and work. It needs, the time is right now to roll up our sleeves, to really include those people if we're going to make this effective, if this is going to be something that is implementable, if it's, if this is going to be actual actions. And I think that's what we need to remember. It was important that we had that conversation. It was important that those national organizations, those families, and all those who contributed were there. But, and that's a solid but, is that there were so much missing. The time has come to open it up, and then we can have something truly valuable out of this that will, as you said, that will stop the genocide, that will address the concerns of our women. I mean, we've been doing this work at the Ontario Native Women's Association for over 50 years. And we need to talk to those people who have been doing the work, who have the experience, who have the knowledge, and who have the motivation to make the changes we need, because we've been doing this and we know it.
Thank you, Dawn. Go ahead, Sheila.
I just like to say here are good things and bad things that I see. And I'm going to talk about substantive things. I've already said there's a gesture in here towards basic income and towards housing. Those are two key social and economic things that I think are good. As I have already pointed out, it's a gesture only, however. So the nod is there. That's positive. On the downside, the fact that the registration of 270,000 women and their descendants has not been treated as a priority key issue is very, very concerning in this. We have thousands of those women, as we've said, who have been exiled from their communities for decades, and they need to be returned in order for the health of communities to be real again. In addition to that, I note that there is nothing in this plan or in this document so far about policing. And that seems to me an extraordinary omission after the reports that we have about the RCMP in Canada and the federal force including the most recent report from Bastarache talking about a misogynist, racist, and homophobic culture inside the RCMP, which clearly affects their treatment of women, and particularly Indigenous women in the communities. There is nothing here about policing. And that's a really big issue. And in addition to that, the question of political voice for Indigenous women, I think, is so key, and it's not being dealt with here in a clear way or an effective way at all.
Thank you so much, Sheila. And I would just add that, you know, in addition, specifically with regards to the federal pathway document, they focus primarily on what they're calling inequities as opposed to genocide. And they list initiatives and ongoing projects and collaborations to solidify that somehow they're already dealing with genocide, but nobody is measuring the impact on the ground. Have any level of government been able to reduce the number of murdered and missing? Has any level of government been able to significantly reduce the number of women and girls in prison and youth corrections? Has anyone been able to reduce the numbers of human trafficking, homelessness, those who suffer from violence? And the very clear answer is no. They have continued to get worse and worse year after year after year. And that's the measure. It's not how many tables or meetings or initiatives that you have, how many funding programs that you can apply for. It's the women and children on the ground. And you can walk into the downtown east side and ask any one of them if all of this in what's in this so-called federal pathway or national action plan is going to make an immediate difference in their lives. And I'm pretty sure the answer would be no. And that's the measure. How many people's lives are we saving and protecting? And I don't see where that is the priority focus. I see a lot of afterwards stuff, a lot of research afterwards, a lot of data afterwards, memorialization afterwards. But what are we doing to stop it? And that's where the federal government and the provinces have fallen down. And I strongly suspect they haven't listened to the groups that they did participate with very fully on that issue, because these groups that were a part of this process have been advocating for a long time about violence prevention, and we simply don't see it. Is there any other questions, first go around questions from the media before we take the second questions? If not, I will go back to Jenny, who has a second question. Or maybe she doesn't want to ask that question. Okay, if I don't see any more questions, then I will ask if anyone has a short closing comment before we bring this to a close. Sheila? No, your hand's up? Okay. Chief Judy?
Oh, yes, thank you. I just wanted to say Canada calls these commitments, but these are not commitments. These are aspirational statements by Canada with promises we've heard before, but have not been addressed, as you mentioned. Some of the tangible things that we need, such as funding for families to find funding to access ways to find their missing, murdered loved ones. I've been on many front lines doing active searches, and these families are not supported in any way to do that, whether they're in the northern BC or Vancouver or in the interior. They find it very difficult to find ways to get funding to do those searches, and we do it on our own and find ways to, and sometimes the searches are very we have to bring in cadaver dogs, or we have to bring in, boats and stuff like that. So, it's not easy searches or ground searches or rough terrain. So the other thing is we needed funding to create navigator positions to help families looking for their loved ones, because I know, Lorelei Williams, I hope she doesn't mind me saying her name, and other Jody Leon and Gladys Raddick, I can think of those ladies. They're helping all these missing, murdered women's cases with no resources, and they invite me to sit in on those case investigations. And it's just really horrendous to see that they have absolutely no support. They're just doing it on a volunteer basis. and they pull together networks that they can. But these are women doing things for women because there are no resources, there are no tangible ways to be able to conduct the very on the ground immediate needs that we have. There's so many gaps, I can't explain it all right now, toward the policing and the justice systems that are failing our women and girls in Two-Spirit across this country. And there needs to be racism studies in the police force if they haven't already been done, because there's so much where the women are afraid to report this still, and they find ways, they're not taken seriously or they're discounted still. Even in this day and age, it's still happening, and we have to have that advocacy and support for them at all times. And that's why there's so much of an increase of missing murdered women and girls continually. We don't have to look very far. It's a lot happening even in my own backyard that we're trying very desperately to help these families and look for their loved ones. Thank you.
Thank you, Chief Judy. Vivienne?
Yes, Vivienne would like to say something. I'd like to add, it's been too long that we've been waiting. Much too long that we've been waiting for action, a concrete action to happen. Our women, our girls are waiting. That a concrete plan. Their plan is not concrete at all. It will never allow us to meet reconciliation. As long as we're waiting. As long as there will not be any reparation, we will never meet reconciliation. Thank you.
Merci, Vivienne. Dawn, do you have a last word?
Yeah, I wanted to say that we need to see this as a call to action. We need the government to see this as a call to action. We need our communities to see this as a call to action, to recognize, to see the gaps. We've pointed them out. We've seen this fragmentation. We've seen people pulling out. Okay, this is a call. The time has come to do this differently now moving forward. And I think that's pretty clear. And what that means for the second phase be done differently, focusing on what we used to call the 3 C's, but it's the 4 C's: the cops, the courts, corrections, child welfare, all of those institutions that are putting our women at risk. We need to address those in concrete ways so that we can break the cycle, so that we're not always having to deal with the crisis after the fact with supportive services. We need to break that cycle. Those upstream investments can lead to significantly less costs in those kinds of systems, which is going to improve so that our children and our women and our families, those mothers who were removed from our communities because of the Indian Act, when they're, have the right to belong again, that they have the right to actually thrive, but really thrive and have the quality of life that everybody wants in this country, and the quality of life that the UNDRIP was supposed to provide for us. And that's going to be key in this. And part of that is recognizing Indigenous women's leadership in the places that we speak from and the places that we live. And that's what's going to make this possible doing forward, if we make a change in how we do things moving forward with this.
We have about 30 seconds left. Sharon, did you want to say anything?
Yes, very quickly. On this conversation, I talked about the work that us and this little committee did. There are many, many, many women out there that have been the forerunners to what we're doing, and there will probably have to be many, many, many women as coming behind us, because Jeanette and my 50 plus years has made a minuscule change. And so I just want to acknowledge that there have been many, many women and their allies doing this work for the past it's been we're in for about 140 years here. And we as Indigenous women have been the ones that have carried the brunt of the abuse and the assimilation practices and all of those. So I just didn't want to leave without acknowledging that there's many more of us out there, and I don't want to kind of think that, okay, I've done all the work, I've done some work, but minuscule in the overall scheme of things.
Thank you so much, Sharon. I think that's a very important point. Unless anyone has anything critical they can get out in a couple of seconds.
Sure, I can. Sheila Day talked about the need for new shelters and transition housing for Indigenous women. It's really crucial. It was mentioned in the National Action Plan, but there was no mention of the need for accessible housing for Indigenous women and girls with disability. And it would really warm my heart to see Prime Minister Justin Trudeau roll up his sleeves and get out there with his hammer.
Thank you. And Sheila, is that your hand? No? Okay. Thank you everyone for participating in this. This was recorded. We will post it. We will also post our press release. Thanks to the media for asking all of your questions and for those who were sharing clips while we were speaking. This is incredibly important work. And again, I'll just end on, what Sharon and everybody else has said. We celebrate and honor the work of all of the groups who have been a part of this for literally generations. Those who were a part of this plan, those who weren't a part of this plan. We know that our hard work isn't the problem here. The problem is with the federal and provincial governments not stepping up and taking responsibility. So thank you all. Merci beaucoup, Walaliag, and you have all of our contact information if you have any follow-up questions. Thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye.